Rain hammered the courthouse steps like angry fingers drumming on stone. The sky so dark it looked bruised. Inside, the air tasted like old paper and whispered secrets. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Grace Mallory sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands folded tight, knuckles pale. Her husband, soon-to-be ex, Michael, lounged across from her as if he'd already won. There was a smirk tugging at his mouth, a gleam in his eye that spoke louder than any accusation. The bailiff called for order, but the storm outside answered louder, rolling thunder against the walls. Before we go deeper into this story, let me ask you something gentle. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or country. It always amazes me how far one fragile thread of story can travel, reaching hearts that have never met. Grace swallowed, feeling the silence closing in on her like a rising tide. She had rehearsed every word in front of the bathroom mirror, whispered them into the sink while her reflection trembled. She believed in preparation, believed in doing what she could with the little she had. But nothing could prepare her for an empty chair beside her. No lawyer, no shield, just her voice in a room built for battle. Michael leaned in, brushing imaginary dust from his expensive jacket. Tough day to come alone, he murmured loud enough for the bench behind them to hear. Guess someone decided you're not worth the money. Grace's heart stuttered. He knew. He wanted her to feel small. Wanted the courtroom to see her as broken, destitute, foolish. The judge hadn't even entered yet, but Michael was already staging his performance. A year ago, she might have cried. 6 months ago, she might have begged. But somewhere between the slammed doors, the silent dinners, and the nights he pretended she didn't exist, something inside her stopped bending. She straightened her spine. Better alone than with a man who talks like you, she whispered back. Michael chuckled, a low, confident sound. We'll see how proud you are in a few minutes. The courtroom doors swung open. People shifted. Papers rustled. A woman with silver-streaked hair set down her coffee and glanced up at Grace with a tiny nod, a stranger's silent encouragement. It warmed her more than the wool sleeves on her dress. Grace remembered the night she left. It had been raining then, too, water cascading down the windows like a warning. Michael didn't yell. He just dismissed her, as if her exhaustion, her fear, her trembling voice were an inconvenience. You should be grateful, he'd said, pacing the kitchen with designer shoes clicking harshly on tile. Most women would kill to live like you. Most men wouldn't forget their wife exists, Grace replied, trembling. He didn't follow her when she walked out with a duffel bag and a shoebox of keepsakes. He just turned up the television. Now, here they were, the end of the unraveling. Grace had practiced answers to every question she thought might come. Finances, dates, receipts, the ways he shut her out of decisions and then blamed her for not being involved. Her voice might crack, she feared. Her palms might sweat, but she wouldn't fold. Michael's attorney arrived, confident and polished, shaking hands and smiling with white teeth and an expensive watch winking beneath his cuff. Grace stared down at the grain in the wooden table, fighting an ache behind her eyes. You ready? He taunted softly. Grace didn't answer. She was ready for something. Maybe not this, but something. Thunder boomed again, vibrating the windows. The judge's door stayed shut. Minutes stretched. Then, footsteps in the hall. Swift, certain, heels clicking in a pace that cut through the murmur. Grace turned, not sure why, as though her bones warned her something momentous was approaching. There, pushing through the heavy doors with rain still clinging to her coat, stood her mother. Ava Mallory wasn't tall, but the room shifted as she crossed it. People straightened unconsciously, sensing an energy they couldn't name. Her chin lifted, her hair pinned neatly despite the storm, eyes scanning until they landed on her daughter. Grace blinked, breath catching. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't wanted to be a burden. She thought she could shoulder this alone. But her mother walked straight to the empty chair at her side, set down a black leather folder, and said quietly, "Scoot over, honey." Michael's smirk faltered. Grace stared. "Mom, what?" Ava squeezed her hand. "You didn't really think you'd face him without me, did you?" Michael's lawyer blinked. Michael sat up straighter. Even the bailiff tilted his head. Ava finally looked at the man who had once called her mom-in-law. Her voice was calm, but it echoed. Let's begin. And just like that, the balance in the room changed mid-breath. The storm outside, finding its answer inside four walls. A hush moved through the courtroom, the kind that falls when everyone feels the rules just changed, even if they don't yet know how. Grace stared at her mother's folder, thick, snapping closed with neat tabs and highlighted lines, and wondered how long Ava had been preparing for this day. How long she had been watching her daughter fight invisible battles and waiting for the moment she could step in without being pushed away. Michael's lawyer cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. And you are. Ava met his gaze, unflinching. I'm here as representation. Michael leaned forward, venom in his tone. Representation? Your daughter hired her mom as her lawyer? That's... Ava cut in, crisp as a blade. Bar-certified attorney, 27 years in family law. You forgot to ask that part. It was rare, delicious, even to see Michael a loss for words. His mouth opened, closed, then twisted into something petty. You still look underqualified. The judge entered just in time to stop the reply Ava might have given. Everyone rose. Grace stood a heartbeat late, her hands still wrapped in her mother's. Emotional whiplash tightening her throat. When they sat, Ava took out a pen, flipped the folder open, and spoke without looking up. Let him mock. It's the last comfort he's going to get in this room. Grace swallowed a laugh that felt dangerously close to a sob. All this time, she had felt like a child trying to fight a hurricane. Now she realized maybe she was the storm's daughter. She inhaled, exhaled. The trembling inside eased. The proceedings began. Dates, statements, accusations tossed like darts. Michael's lawyer was slick, practiced, but Ava was something sharper. She didn't posture, didn't brag. She simply waited, then dismantled each point with steady precision. No, Your Honor, that message is out of context. Here is the full thread. Actually, the financial records show something different. Flip to page 9. Yes, my client left the home, but only after repeated neglect, which we can demonstrate with testimony and correspondence. Each word felt like someone slowly untying knots around Grace's ribs. Michael's jaw tensed. He wasn't used to losing ground, especially not to a woman he dismissed as gentle, forgettable, harmless. Grace couldn't stop watching him, the rise and fall of his chest, the twitch at his temple, the widening panic disguised under sarcasm. And then, something happened so small it was almost nothing, yet everything. Ava rested a hand on her daughter's knee under the table. That simple touch broke something inside Grace. She had been holding her breath for months, maybe years, ever since she realized her love wasn't enough to make someone treat her well. Now she remembered. She didn't walk away because she was weak. She walked away because she deserved better than to slowly disappear. And sitting beside her was proof she hadn't disappeared at all. The first testimony ended. Papers shuffled. A silence settled. One of those rare pauses where time balances on a knife edge, deciding which way the day will tumble. A thought rose through Grace's mind like sunlight, finding its way through storm clouds. Maybe this wasn't the end of her life. Maybe it was the beginning. And if she could feel beginnings again, maybe she wasn't broken. Before the next witness was called, the judge asked if Grace wished to speak. Her heart kicked hard, fear's first instinct, but her mother leaned close and whispered, "Only if you want to." For the first time in too long, Grace realized she had a choice. She stood. Her voice wavered at first, the tremor of a bridge stepping out over nothing. But it grew steadier with each syllable. "I'm not here to punish anyone," she said quietly. "I just want the chance to build a life where I'm not invisible." Michael scoffed, loud and careless, and several heads turned his way. Grace didn't look at him. "And I want to be treated like a person again," she finished. That's all. Her words didn't roar. They didn't accuse. They landed soft, and that softness carried more weight than any shout. Pause for trigger. Seamlessly continues in narrative flow below. If you were sitting in that courtroom, what would your heart have told you to do? Be honest, say in the comments. And if finding the words feels too heavy right now, just tap like to say compassion still matters. Grace sat again, heart pounding but proud of its own beating. Ava nodded, as if she had never doubted a thing. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the one inside the courtroom had shifted. Not gone, not yet, but redirected. Michael leaned toward his lawyer, whispering fiercely now, confidence cracking at the edges. His eyes flicked toward Grace with something new. Not respect, not regret, but realization. The woman he belittled wasn't crumbling anymore. And he had no idea how to win against someone who had finally stood up. The judge motioned to continue, but Grace felt the balance shifting grain by grain. This wasn't the end. It was only the first fracture in Michael's certainty. And the next strike was still to come, just waiting for its cue. The next witness was called, but Grace barely heard the name. The tide inside her was still shifting, the kind of inner movement you feel more in your spine than in your ears. She'd spoken. She hadn't fallen apart. And somehow, that mattered more than she expected. A woman approached the stand. Neat blouse, hair pulled into a tight bun. Grace recognized her slowly. Elena, the neighbor who lived 2 doors down during the last year of the marriage. The woman who had watered her front porch plants once when Grace forgot, who had offered a soft, rough night, without asking for details. Michael stiffened. He hadn't expected her. The questioning began. Ava didn't rush. She let silence do half the work, luring truth from corners it had hidden in for months. Elena, did you observe the couple during the time they lived next to you? Yes, Elena answered, voice low but certain. I saw Grace most evenings, usually alone. And her husband? Michael. Elena exhaled, a slow release of frustration. He'd pull up late, sometimes with loud company, sometimes silent. He rarely went inside right away. He'd sit in the car, scrolling his phone, like walking through the door was the last thing he wanted. Michael's lawyer objected. Relevance, speculation, but the judge overruled. Ava's voice softened. Did you ever hear arguments? No. That was the strange part, Elena replied. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. I'd see her come outside with her eyes swollen. Not bruises, but tired. Worn down. Like she was shrinking. Grace stared at her hands, throat thick. Someone had seen her, really seen her, when she thought she had evaporated from the world's notice. And did Michael ever speak to you? Elena hesitated. Then, once. You were out of town visiting family, Grace. She turned toward her, sympathetic. He laughed, and said he hoped the house stayed quiet. Nice to have a break from the deadweight, he said. Michael jerked upright. I never said that. Elena didn't even blink. You did, and you smirked while saying it. Grace's lungs emptied slowly, the deeper kind of ache where old wounds reopen because truth finally touched them. Ava nodded once, satisfied. No more questions. Michael's attorney scrambled, but every question he shot forward only trapped him tighter. Elena didn't embellish, didn't rant. She answered plainly, and the courtroom began to feel lopsided again, like chairs slanted toward one side. Grace felt something inside her loosen, the tension she'd carried tucked behind ribs and heart. And she wondered how many people had been silently waiting for her to leave, the way she had waited for herself to wake up. As the witness stepped down, Grace's gaze swept the courtroom. Some strangers offered small nods, a silent chorus saying, "We see you." Pause for trigger, naturally woven. Have you ever had someone step up for you when you couldn't speak for yourself? Type yes, and share their name if your heart is willing. Gratitude deserves to be said out loud sometimes. Ava tapped her pen once, twice, then leaned slightly toward her daughter. You're doing beautifully, she whispered, voice steady with pride. Grace swallowed a tremble. I didn't know she noticed. Oh, honey, Ava murmured. People see more than we think. You are hurting, and some folks look away, but the right ones don't. Her mother's words warmed her like sunlight after too many gray mornings. She thought back to nights curled on the couch, staring at nothing while Michael scrolled endlessly on his phone. She remembered how invisible she felt beside the man who used to love her, or at least said he had. She had tried to fix it, cooked dinners he didn't eat, wrote little notes he never read, suggested therapy he dismissed. She locked her pain behind polite smiles and swallowed sentences she desperately needed to speak. And each small silence chipped another piece of her away. But today, she was reclaiming them, each lost fragment gathering like snowflakes on her tongue, melting into courage. The judge shifted papers. The next name was called, someone unexpected. Michael himself. His attorney glanced at him, uncertain. But the judge insisted. Michael walked to the witness stand with a swagger he forced into existence, shoulders squared too tightly, chin angled high. As he took the oath, his eyes flicked toward Grace, a warning, a plea, a question. She couldn't tell which. He sat. State your version, the judge ordered. And Michael began. He spun a narrative smooth as glass. A dutiful husband, a confused wife, a marriage that unraveled because she pulled away, because she misunderstood, because she imagined problems that weren't there. He painted himself as patient, tolerant, even generous for letting her go. Grace's stomach twisted, the lies so gentle they sounded like reason. But then Ava stood. I have a few questions. Michael smirked. Of course you do. Her steps were measured, her expression unreadable, a woman who had waited for this very moment. You say you were supportive, she began calmly. How many date nights did you initiate in the last 12 months, Mr. Mallory? Michael blinked. I don't track those things. No need, Ava said, lifting a document. Grace did. 0. A whisper rippled through the spectators. And how many holidays did you spend together last year? He shifted uncomfortably. I was busy. With work, Ava supplied. Or with a coworker your wife didn't know about? Another objection. Another overrule. Grace inhaled sharply. She hadn't known her mother knew that part. Michael's facade cracked visibly. A splinter, then a fracture, and the courtroom watched his confidence bleed through it like ink through fabric. Ava continued, relentless but calm, as if she were simply letting him tell on himself with every answer he gave. Grace didn't need revenge. She didn't want humiliation, but she could feel dignity rebuilding inside her, bone by bone. And even Michael, for the first time, seemed to sense he was losing more than a case. He was losing the last version of himself she ever cared about. The air tightened, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to hear what came next. Michael cleared his throat, but the smooth bravado he relied on had slipped from his voice like rain sliding off glass. Ava paced slowly, giving every step its weight. You testified you were devoted, present, supportive. Michael nodded stiffly. Then how? Ava said, flipping a page as casually as turning a menu. Do you explain these credit card charges? Out-of-town hotels. Dinners for 2. She slid a stack across to the judge. Michael's attorney lunged for an objection, but the judge raised a hand. Overruled. Continue. Grace watched her ex-husband's face drain of color, the truth catching up to him quicker than the lie he had rehearsed. She felt no triumph, only a kind of solemn, overdue clarity. I travel for work, he muttered. Ava's voice never rose. Every weekend, he swallowed. Sometimes, with the same woman, his jaw clenched. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. The courtroom murmured, a collective intake of breath, the soft thud of sympathy shifting sides. Grace didn't look away. She kept her eyes on Michael, not with hatred, but with the finality of someone holding a door open so she could walk out for good. Ava leaned in, voice gentle in a way that made the words sharper. When someone stops showing up at home, it leaves the other person living like a shadow, she said. And shadows only stretch for so long before the light finds them again. Michael flinched. His attorney rubbed his temples, clearly wishing the floor might swallow them both. The judge called a brief recess, but Grace sat frozen, unable to move. Her body hummed with adrenaline, not the frantic rush of fear, but the steady, pulsing strength of someone finally understood. She inhaled. The air tasted different, cleaner. Ava touched her shoulder. Step outside with me? Just a minute. In the hallway, the storm had calmed to dripping gutters and quiet puddles. Grace leaned against the cool marble wall, the chill grounding her. I didn't want you to know about the other woman, she said softly. Ava brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. I didn't want you to think I needed to know. Pain doesn't have to be proven to be believed. Grace blinked, eyes hot. How did you find out? Ava gave a faint, rueful smile. Mothers don't sleep when their children are hurting. I looked, and when I found too much, I waited for you to be ready. Grace pressed a palm to her chest, stunned that love could be so quiet, so patient. They stood like that for a moment, together, breathing in the same storm-soaked air, the way they hadn't done since Grace was a girl afraid of the dark. When they returned inside, something in the room had shifted again. People watched Grace differently now. She wasn't the fragile wife abandoned by her own lawyer. She was the woman whose truth had finally been spoken out loud. But Ava wasn't done. The recess ended. Michael sat stiffly, anger simmering under his skin, but no longer spilling out as mockery. More like fear wearing a coat of indignation. Ava resumed questioning, but this time she slowed down. No more rapid-fire blows. Mr. Mallory, she asked, did you ever ask your wife what she needed? He scoffed. I provided everything. No, Ava clarified. You purchased things. That is not the same. His brows furrowed. Did you ever sit with her while she cried? Did you ask her why she trembled when you came home late? Did you ask her why she stopped smiling? Why she couldn't sleep? Why she never finished dinner? Silence fell across the courtroom, thick, weighted, and aching. Michael opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Grace felt her heartbeat slow, each thud something she had earned. Ava stepped closer, voice softening in a way that somehow hurt more. Marriage is not measured by bank statements. It's measured by presence, or the absence of it. And you were gone long before she walked out. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable but attentive. Michael stared down at his hands. For a moment, just a flicker, Grace thought she saw shame. But it dissolved quickly into defensiveness. He muttered, she gave up on me first. Ava didn't respond to the lie disguised as self-pity. She simply returned to the table, set down her pen, and rested her hand once more over her daughter's. Grace felt something inside her rise like a tide finally turning its back on shore. Pause for trigger, seamlessly folded. Now it's your turn. Share one small good thing you did for someone recently, even if no one noticed. Write it below, so others remember kindness still exists. Your story might be the reminder someone scrolling tonight desperately needs. Grace exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening another notch. This wasn't over. Not yet. The judge still had decisions to make, words still needed to be spoken, truths still waiting to surface. But as Grace looked at her mother, at the folder, at the courtroom no longer stacked against her, she realized she was no longer surviving the moment. She was taking back her life. And the part of her that once whispered I can't, was finally learning to say, watch me. The courtroom resumed with a kind of weary electricity, the feeling people get when they know they're witnessing a turning point, even if they can't say why. Grace sat straighter now, the wooden chair no longer feeling like a place she was being held captive, but one she chose to occupy. Michael's testimony stumbled forward for another few minutes, but it was clear the momentum had shifted beyond recovery. His answers arrived hesitant, chipped at the edges, all confidence drained into thin air. The lawyer beside him scribbled frantic notes he never seemed sure how to use. Finally, the attorney rested his papers. No further questions, he muttered, shoulders sagging. A hush lingered. The judge tapped her pen, glancing between both parties before turning her gaze to Ava. If the defense has additional evidence, proceed. Ava paused. She looked at Grace first, seeking permission, not strategizing. Grace nodded once. It was the smallest gesture, but inside her, it thundered like a drum. Ava rose. Your Honor, I'd like to submit my final exhibit. Not documents, not receipts. A letter. Michael's brow creased. Grace stiffened slightly. She didn't know about a letter. Ava lifted a single sheet of paper. The edges were soft, worn like it had been folded and unfolded many times. This is a note my daughter wrote 6 months before she left, Ava said. She never sent it. She didn't show it to a lawyer. She didn't even show it to me. I found it tucked inside a notebook when she moved back home. Grace's breath hitched. I'm offering it not as accusation, Ava continued, but as evidence of her state of mind, not of anger, but of grief. The judge nodded. Read it. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. Ava unfolded the paper carefully, like it was glass. Her voice softened, but every syllable carried truth. Michael, I don't know how I got here. I look at you, and I miss someone who used to see me. You walk past me now like I'm furniture, something that stays in the same place so you don't have to think about it. I'm disappearing inside this house. I want to tell you everything, that I'm scared, that I feel small, that I don't know how to reach you anymore. But every time I open my mouth, you walk away first. If you asked, I'd fight for us. But I can't be the only one fighting. If you ever notice the door closing behind me, just know it closed slowly, 1,000 days at a time. A sound escaped Grace, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, just the release of something she hadn't even known she was holding. Michael stared ahead, face rigid, knuckles white as bone. The courtroom was silent. No one breathed until Ava finished. She folded the letter gently and set it down. My client tried, she said quietly. She didn't give up. She was left alone in a space meant for two, and she walked away only when staying meant losing herself entirely. Grace felt tears spill, steady, quiet, unapologetic. She didn't wipe them away. Michael looked at her, then, really looked, as though seeing something invisible for the first time. A flicker of realization crossed his face. Maybe regret. Maybe too late recognition. Maybe shock that the woman he dismissed had carried so much weight without him noticing. Ava returned to her seat, her hand closing around Grace's, warm and strong as a vow. And in that moment, even the walls seemed to breathe. Pause for trigger, naturally folded. If that moment hit you hard, leave a red heart in the comments. Sometimes a single symbol speaks for us when our voices shake too much to form the words. Michael shifted, the fight draining entirely out of him. Not in defeat, but in something sadder. Acceptance. He closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to suggest a memory flashed behind them. A dinner he forgot to show up for. A birthday he let slip. A wife crying in a room he never walked into. None of it excused him. None of it erased the years. But for the first time all day, he didn't smirk, didn't scoff, didn't roll his eyes. He whispered, barely audible, I didn't know. Grace lifted her head slowly, voice clear though her cheeks were wet. I tried to tell you, she said. You just weren't listening. Their eyes held. Not as lovers, not as enemies, but as two people finally standing at the same painful truth. The judge leaned forward. Thank you. I've heard enough from both sides today. We'll reconvene for my decision after lunch. The gavel tapped, crisp and final. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. The crowd exhaled. Grace remained sitting for a moment, hands folded, breathing slowly through the aftershock of her own heart. She had just lived through the moment she feared most. And she was still here. Not erased. Not broken. Still here. The lunch recess scattered people in the hallways like leaves blown by wind. Some stayed nearby, whispering about the letter that had hung in the air like smoke. Others walked outside, needing fresh air after sitting inside such raw truth. Grace remained in the courtroom a minute longer, her palm resting over the imprint her letter had left on the table, as if touching the paper itself might anchor her. Ava nudged her gently. Come on. You need food, or at least something warm to hold. They stepped outside. The rain had softened to a mist, the kind that clings to your skin and hair like a whisper rather than a warning. The sky was still gray, but lighter, bruises healing at the edge of the clouds. Grace and her mother found a bench beneath a thin awning. People passed, some nodding to her, others pretending not to stare at the woman whose heart had been read aloud. Grace didn't mind anymore. Ava handed her a cup of something steaming and sweet from a courthouse kiosk. Hot chocolate, the kind she used to make when Grace was small. For a moment, they sat quietly, letting warmth fill the spaces words couldn't reach. You know, Ava finally said, there was a time I was afraid you would stay. Grace looked up, surprised. Stay? With him? Ava nodded. Not because you loved him, but because you forgot you could leave. Grace stared into her cup. I did forget, she admitted. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, a busy season, that if I waited a little longer, he'd look at me again. Her voice thinned. Eventually, it felt easier to disappear than to ask for more. Ava exhaled softly. That letter, you wrote it because you still believe there was something left to save. Grace blinked at that, emotion tugging hard. I did. I begged for him without ever using the words. And today, Ava said, touching her hand, you finally spoke them out loud. Not to him, to yourself. Grace swallowed. Something deep inside her. Something she thought she'd buried in a box and shoved to the back of her mind. Stirred awake. I keep wondering, Grace whispered. What if I walked away too soon? What if we could've? Ava squeezed her hand before she could spiral. I love you, Grace. But hear this. You stayed long enough to lose yourself. Leaving wasn't quitting. It was survival. Grace let those words settle like sand in clear water. Across the courtyard, Michael appeared alone, leaning against a tree, staring at nothing. His attorney was nowhere in sight. Rain beaded on his jacket. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders curled inward in a way Grace had never seen. Not proud, not angry, just small. Her breath hitched with something she didn't expect. Not hatred, not vengeance. Sadness. For the man he could have been. For the marriage they both let drown. For the love that never learned to swim. Ava followed her gaze. You don't owe him anything, she said gently. Not even sympathy. But Grace shook her head slowly. Maybe not. But I feel it anyway. Ava studied her for a long moment, and then nodded, not with disapproval, but respect. You always had a soft heart, she murmured. It's your strength, not your weakness. They finished their drink and walked back inside as the clouds thinned further, letting a pale beam break through. It touched the steps, the windows, the edge of Grace's coat, as if offering a quiet promise. Inside, the courtroom gathered once more, the energy muted but alert, like everyone sensed the chapter was about to close. Grace sat in the same chair, but she no longer felt caged inside it. Michael returned to his table. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time since the marriage cracked, there was no smirk, no shield. Just a man finally seeing the consequences of his own silence. Grace inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She didn't hope for magic or miracles. She didn't need validation or victory. She just needed peace. Pause for trigger. Story flows through it. Be honest. After everything you've heard, could you forgive someone who hurt you this way? Type forgive if you could, or never if your heart would need to stay far away. Michael's attorney shuffled papers, but seemed almost relieved the talking was nearly done. Ava clicked her pen once, the signal Grace now recognized. Readiness, not aggression. The judge entered again, robe flowing, expression composed but contemplative. Be seated, she instructed. I've considered all testimony and evidence. The room stilled. Grace's pulse fluttered once, then steadied. She reached for her mother's hand, not because she needed saving anymore, but because some victories are meant to be held together. The judge took a slow breath before speaking. Today's case is about responsibility. Not just financial, but emotional. The court finds. And as her voice rang out in that silent room, Grace realized the verdict mattered. Of course it did, but not nearly as much as the transformation that had already taken place inside her. No matter what came next, she was no longer the woman who walked in alone. She was something new, something whole, something finally free. In favor of the petitioner, the judge concluded. With those 6 quiet syllables, the air shifted, not dramatically, not cinematically, but like a tight knot finally loosening. Grace felt her breath leave her body in one slow, trembling exhale. She expected fireworks, applause, some internal trumpet blast. Instead, relief arrived like a warm hand on her shoulder. The judge continued. Assets divided according to Exhibit B. Spousal support granted until further review. And personal property, including items disputed, shall remain with Ms. Mallory. Michael stiffened. A muscle along his jaw pulsed once, twice before going still. But he didn't erupt. He didn't argue. He simply lowered his gaze, shoulders dipping beneath the weight of a decision that had been years in the making. Grace felt neither gloating nor vindication, only a strange, settling stillness. It was done. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Court is adjourned. Chairs slid back. Murmurs rose. Papers rustled. The courtroom began to dissolve into motion. But Grace stayed seated a beat longer, not because she was afraid to move, but because she wanted to savor the quiet inside her chest. Ava squeezed her hand, smiling not with triumph, but something gentler. "You did it," she whispered. Grace shook her head, smiling through misted eyes. "We did." They stood. Someone from the back row caught her gaze, a woman she didn't know who mouthed, "Good for you." Another gave her a small thumbs up. Grace felt her chest tighten with gratitude she didn't know where to place. She walked toward the aisle and then stopped. Michael stood there, blocking her path. Not aggressively, just standing. His face was unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat, the first real sound he'd made since the verdict. "I didn't expect you to fight like that." Grace studied him, the man she once married, the man she once adored, and the man she eventually had to save herself from. "I didn't expect to," she replied. "But being invisible gets heavy. Eventually, you stand up just to make sure you still exist." Michael looked away, swallowing hard. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." "I know," Grace said. "But you did anyway." Those 5 words hung between them. Not an accusation, not a defense, just truth. He gave a small nod, one filled with reluctant understanding. Maybe I should have listened." "Maybe," Grace agreed. "But it's done now." He looked at her then, not with anger, not even regret, but with something she hadn't seen before, humility. His next words weren't rehearsed or pretty. "I hope you find what you were missing." Grace felt her throat tighten. She could have thrown 1,000 answers at him, years worth of unspoken replies. But she chose the simplest truth. "I already am." Michael stepped aside. Grace walked past him, not as his wife, not as the woman who left, but as herself. Once outside the courtroom, sunlight had finally broken through the clouds. Puddles on the courthouse steps sparkled like scattered glass. People bustled past, unaware that the world had just shifted for one quiet woman and a mother who stood beside her. Ava linked their arms. "Lunch number 2? She teased. Grace laughed, a sound that felt new inside her mouth. "Absolutely." They walked together through the courtyard, footsteps splashing lightly. Grace breathed deeper now, each inhale pulling in pieces of her new life. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. A text from Elena, just 2 words. "Proud of you." Grace smiled. She typed back, "Thank you for seeing me." She put the phone away and let her gaze drift upward. The clouds had parted just enough to show patches of blue sky, the promise of something better. She realized then that the verdict wasn't the happy ending. Leaving wasn't the climax. Winning wasn't the victory. The victory was rediscovering the parts of herself she'd buried, the laughter she swallowed, the dreams she shelved, the courage she didn't know she owned. She felt lighter with every step, her pulse settling into a rhythm that matched the world outside. Steady, sure, alive. Pause for trigger, seamlessly woven. If you believe love, real love, the kind that heals instead of hides, still wins in the end, drop amen in the comments. Let's fill this part of the story with hope. Maybe someone scrolling tonight needs a reason to keep going. Ava nudged her gently. "You want to go home or somewhere else?" Grace paused. "Home," she decided, but not the old one. The one I'm building next. Ava smiled like a sunrise. "Then let's start." And as they walked under the now brightening sky, Grace felt something blooming quietly in her chest, something that had been waiting patiently beneath layers of fear. Hope, not the fragile kind that breaks the moment someone disappoints you. The durable kind, the kind that grows inside the cracks and says, "You survived." Home wasn't a place Grace returned to. It was a place she started building one quiet moment at a time. Weeks passed, then a month. The courthouse faded into a memory she could hold without flinching. The letter Ava read didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a reminder of how far her feet had carried her once she finally moved. Grace stood in her new apartment, small, sunlit, imperfect in ways that made it charming. A plant she couldn't identify sat on the windowsill. A candle flickered on the table. Half-finished art pieces leaned against one wall, proof that she was learning to do things for no one's approval but her own. Her phone buzzed. Elena again, asking if she wanted to join a book club. Another message arrived, a co-worker inviting her on a weekend hike. Grace smiled at both. She hadn't realized how lonely she'd been until she wasn't anymore. But the biggest change was quieter than a social calendar. It happened inside her mornings. She woke up without dread. She walked in her kitchen and brewed coffee for herself, not to be waiting when someone else came home. She looked in the mirror and didn't search for someone missing. She simply met the woman standing there. Ava visited often, but not to hover. Just to sit on the couch, drinking tea, listening to Grace talk about things she loved again. One evening, as twilight painted the sky a tender shade of rose and gold, Grace told her mother something she'd never said aloud. "I thought I failed," she murmured, twisting a cushion in her hands. "I thought leaving meant I couldn't make my marriage work." Ava looked at her with eyes that had seen her through every stage. Baby, child, woman, heartbroken wife, reborn self. "There's no failure in walking away from something that stopped being true," she said. "The only failure would have been losing yourself permanently." Grace nodded slowly, feeling that lesson settled deep in her bones. Later, alone on her balcony, she let the breeze lift her hair and close her eyes against the gentle hum of cars and distant laughter from the street below. Life outside went on, as chaotic, messy, and beautiful as ever. She found herself thinking of Michael for the first time in weeks, not with longing or bitterness, but with a kind of distant clarity. She hoped he healed too. She hoped he learned to show up for the next person who opened their heart to him. But she no longer felt responsible for saving him. Her own life, and all the future versions of it she hadn't lived yet, needed her more. A soft knock sounded on her door. She opened it to find her mom holding 2 pints of ice cream and a smile. No reason. Just celebrating ordinary days. Ava shrugged. Grace laughed and stepped aside to let her in. They sat cross-legged on the floor, eating straight from the containers, watching the city lights flicker to life outside. Ava tapped her spoon lightly on Grace's hand. "You know what I'm proudest of?" she asked. Grace raised an eyebrow. "That I didn't fall apart?" Ava shook her head. "No, that you let me help. Letting someone in, that's the bravest part." Grace's throat tightened with gratitude she had no words for. She leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling held in a way she hadn't in years. And then, gently, surprisingly, she felt something bloom inside her chest. A wish, but not for the past. A dream, fragile but alive, reaching forward into seasons she hadn't met yet. She imagined laughter in the living room, trips to places she'd never seen, friendships deep enough to spill secrets into. Maybe, far down a distant road, love again. The kind that doesn't whisper deceit or turn rooms cold. The kind that sees her. The kind she now knew she deserved. But tonight, that was enough. Ice cream, her mother, and the slow rebuild of a heart rediscovering itself. Pause for the final trigger, woven in emotion. If this journey touched you, don't scroll past quietly. Tap like, not for me, but for every person who has walked through pain and still chose kindness on the other side. Let it be your way of saying, I felt this. I'm with you. A soft silence wrapped the room. Ava leaned her head against hers. You're going to be okay, she murmured. Grace smiled through full eyes. I already am. Outside, the city glowed. Inside, a woman who once thought she had to fight alone realized she never had. And somewhere, unseen but true, the storm cloud from that courtroom day dissolved completely, making room for the quiet warmth of new beginnings. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from where they stopped being seen and step into the life waiting for them just beyond the door.